how to rescue a troubled digital transformation project, new software pricing models in the enterprise tech space, and how to create a realistic implementation plan for your project. Those are just a few of the topics we'll cover here in episode 251 of Transformation Ground Control.
Welcome to Transformation Ground Control. Ground Control. The podcast that covers everything related to digital transformation. This podcast features technology agnostic and international discussions related to digital strategy, software selection, implementation, change management, business process optimization, and everything else you need to know to make your digital transformation project successful. Whether you're embarking on an ERP implementation, supply chain transformation, or any other business or digital transformation, this podcast is for you. Now, here's your host, Eric Kimberling.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Ground control to Major Tom.
Hello, welcome to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 251. This is the podcast that is tech agnostic and covers everything related to digital strategy, including the people, process, and technology aspects of transformations. Thank you for being here today. You can find new episodes of the show every Wednesday at transformationgroundcontrol.com. The show is sponsored by Third Stage Consulting Group, an independent tech agnostic consulting firm, and the podcast is sponsored by or produced by Major Tom Productions. So thank you for being here today. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent and tech agnostic consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world with their digital transformation journeys. And joining me, as always, is Darian Chwialkowski. Darian, thanks for being here today.
Yeah, I'm excited for another episode.
Yeah, another great episode planned for you today. We're going to talk about digital strategies and failures and how to get projects back on track if they are troubled. We're going to start off with some social media questions, though, and get into some questions that we've received from you, all the audience here. And then we'll get into a couple of newsworthy topics that are worth discussing. One is how end-to-end encryption is the next front line in the government's data. And then we'll also talk about new software pricing models and how they're reshaping CIO negotiation power. And then later in the show, we're going to talk about how to rescue a digital transformation project that's gone sideways. So if you're involved in a digital transformation and you feel like it might be getting a little off track, or even if you don't, chances are high that there's stuff that you are going to learn from this discussion that might help you identify what those risks are and be able to address those risks before they become too big of an issue. We're going to talk about that later in the show. And then last but not least, late in the show, our last segment, we'll get into how to create a realistic digital transformation project plan. So we'll talk about what the difference is between project plans and the reality of those plans, and how you can actually start off with a realistic plan rather than letting the surprises catch up to you later. Let's just get the surprises out on the table now so that we can create a realistic plan from the beginning. So that's what we're going to talk about later in the segment. But before we get into all that stuff, Darian, what kind of questions have you received recently on social media?
Yeah, this first question, I don't think we've ever received one like this before, but the person asked, what's the point of trends for the next year if big tech companies have secured funding guarantees for the next 10 years?
Yeah, that's a good question. If they've received funding for the next 10 years and they know they're going to be successful for the next 10 years, they're always trying to push, for that next big thing. What is the next thing that's going to increase their valuation? How could they push the lock that they have with their customers for even longer? And so they are playing somewhat of a long game for sure in terms of trying to get that vendor lock or getting their customers locked into their platforms. So yeah, on one hand, what is the point of the trends predictions if they've already got funding through the next 10 years? They're constantly changing, they're constantly evolving. And I think the way I always look at predictions is what does it mean to the customers? I'm looking at more from the customer perspective or the client perspective of what the trends predictions are. So that's the way I generally would look at it.
Yeah, for sure. And our next question today too is, have you worked with Journal Technologies before? I'm curious to get your input there and how it stacks up against Tyler Tech.
Yeah, I saw that question come through on LinkedIn. I have not had a chance to go look at Journal Technologies. I am not familiar with them. Tyler Technologies is one that we see a lot in the government tech space. And in Tyler Technologies, for those that don't know, is a government technology solution that is built on the Microsoft platform. They've developed somewhat of a tailored solution for government and public sector institutions, they compete with Workday and SAP and Oracle, of course, for the public sector. But I'm not familiar with journal technologies.
Got it. Yeah, super interesting question. So maybe we'll revisit that once you have the chance to look into it a little bit further. But to switch gears here and get into our first newsworthy article of the day, talking about government with Tyler Tech, like you were saying, we have end-to-end encryption becomes the new battleground in government data. So what this article is talking about is the Swiss public sector data protection officers are warning that data residency alone no longer delivers true sovereignty, and that they're pushing for customers controlled end-to-end encryption for sensitive government data. Their guidance explicitly calls out the international SaaS platform like Microsoft D365, arguing that most SaaS solutions don't prevent providers from accessing plain text data and therefore create a significant loss of control. Also, what they were saying, some key takeaways are that customer held keys and E2E encryption change the cloud value equation. So when a government holds keys and providers can't see plain text, they lose access to search, indexing, advanced collaboration, AI assistance, and some native security analytics. Cloud goes from smart managed platforms to secure but partially blind infrastructure, forcing CIOs to rethink which workloads truly belong there. And then along with that, regulators are shifting from trusting contracts, SLAs, and regional data centers to demanding hard technical controls. So they are saying, like, we promise not to look is giving a way to we technically can't look. And then lastly on this, most cloud native AI features and copilots depend on provider side access to data. So as agencies are pushing for true end-to-end encryption on sensitive data sets, they'll need new AI analytics or new AI and analytic patterns that keep keys and everything under their control or accept reduced AI capabilities, essentially. So with all of this, Eric, just want to get your initial take, and how should government segment workloads kind of split between E2E encrypted and standard cloud to balance functionality, cost, and risk?
Yeah, so I think it brings up a really good point, because the sovereignty is a big deal especially for governments and government contractors, but anyone who's working with sensitive information, they care about where the information is stored. But the encryption and the security protocols behind it is really interesting, because there's what seems to be a false or faulty perception that because it's a SaaS solution, that SaaS software provider must be providing world-class security that you don't need to worry about. Well, in this case, it sounds like they do need to worry about it, because it's not meeting their cybersecurity needs and the encryption standards they're looking for. And so you've got to figure out not only where the workflows reside, but just what systems you're going to use in the cloud. What systems and data do you feel comfortable hosting in the cloud, especially if it's outside your country or if it's in another country, versus information that maybe isn't as sensitive, that you can be a little more flexible with the type of provider that you are considering. So I think it's just a good reminder. If anything, this should be a good takeaway or a good reminder to organizations that even the biggest hyperscalers in the world or the biggest cloud software providers in the world aren't necessarily going to provide the cybersecurity protocols you need. They're not necessarily going to provide the data sovereignty you're going to need. They're not necessarily going to provide the workflows and capabilities that you need. And so just like any software technology decision, you just need to fully understand your risks and the trade-offs when you go into the purchasing decision, as well as when you make the implementation as well.
For sure. And with that, how should CIOs and CISOs measure the real trade-off between losing some SaaS features and gaining stronger protection from foreign legal access and surveillance risk?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think a lot of times, a lot of us, myself included, assume that better capabilities is better, or the most important thing is you're getting more capabilities. But it could be that you're willing to give up some of those capabilities in the name of cybersecurity or having more control over your data, whatever the case may be. And so I think this gets back into a more fundamental question or challenge that organizations need to focus on, which is, how do you define that digital strategy that doesn't treat or look at things like a one-size-fits-all solution? It's not all cloud. It's not all SaaS. It's not all on premise. It's not all just one software vendor. You've got to look at your entire landscape of technology and your options to understand what's that deliberate strategy that's going to allow you to make the best decisions for your business, and what's the set of risks that go along with that, so that you can focus on mitigating those risks for whatever path you choose.
For sure. Yeah, super interesting topic for sure. But I want to get into our next newsworthy article of the day. And this one is about how new software pricing models are reshaping CIO negotiation power. Eric, I think you're going to maybe find this interesting. It says that what's happening is enterprise software vendors are shifting away from seat-based and module-based licensing and toward value-based pricing, AI usage fees, and consumption-driven metrics such as API calls, data volume, workflow automations, and model inference units. CIOs report sudden cost spikes as vendor bundle AI features into core products and raise prices, sometimes double digits even, but that's without clear ROI or transparent usage definitions. These changes are driving renewal shocks, especially for organizations that historically negotiated based on user count, not operational usage patterns or the model-driven workload costs. Some key takeaways are pricing is becoming a moving target. So static seating based pricing made budgeting predictable. But with AI and consumption pricing introduced, that unpredictability can cause budgeting issues, obviously, for businesses. CIOs must negotiate usage definitions and not just discounts. So every new metric, API call, AI token, workflow, upload, inference unit must be clearly defined, capped, and audited. Without these hard definitions, vendors can shift thresholds mid-contract, creating unplanned overruns. And then lastly, vendor lock-in obviously intensifies. I know this is something we talk about a lot on here, but when workflows, integrations, and automations are built around proprietary usage metrics, it becomes harder for CIOs to switch platforms. This strengthens vendor power and weakens traditional renewal negotiation leverage. Eric, what is your just first initial reaction to this article? I feel like you maybe aren't so super surprised by it, but yeah, I want to get your initial reaction.
Yeah, it's super interesting because I've been wondering when that time will come, and maybe it's coming now, where as cool as AI is and as much capability as there is behind AI, at what point does AI become a really an accelerated cost? And I think AI certainly costs money, but I think with vendor lock, when you combine the vendor lock with AI, that's a pretty deadly combination for customers, because now you're even more locked in, because not only is your back office enterprise data tied up in these applications, but now you're relying on them to provide the AI agents and the other AI capabilities you want. And then next thing you know, they're charging you for all the AI agents you've deployed and all the data you're using, all the integration you're doing to other systems. And it's sort of a shakedown. It's like, hey, we're going to raise the price because we can. Now, from the technology vendor and the investor perspective, this is awesome. This is great news, because that's exactly what they want. I read this article just the other day. I think it was just yesterday, actually, on LinkedIn. Someone posted an article about how unstoppable the current enterprise tech space is. And I read it because it actually runs counter to a lot of what I'll say, which is, I think there's chinks in the armor or cracks in the foundation of the current incumbents in the enterprise tech space, because I think the way they're leveraging their power, and in some cases being accused of monopolistic antitrust behavior, and they're pissing off customers left and right. I've been talking more about the negative fallout from that, but I read this article and I was super fascinated because they were talking about how great this is. And they were coming at it from the perspective of a technology vendor and investors in the tech space, about how great this is and what a good job software vendors are doing of creating vendor lock, or creating lock with their customers. And it was really interesting because I always think vendor lock is bad. In my mind, I think it's bad, but I'm looking at it from the perspective of clients. But in this case, in everything you're talking about, this is great for the vendors, because now they've got you locked in. They can charge you more. They can, justify it in the name of value or whatever they want. But the reality is they're doing it because they know you're not going to switch. It's going to be super painful and disruptive for you to switch once you're locked in. So let's just get you locked in, do what it takes to get you there, and then we'll will sort of it will sort of ramp up the costing and the pricing models after that. So I think the key is, from a negotiation perspective, you just want to make sure you don't get too locked in and that you negotiate long term, not just for the immediate deal you're getting, because you're going to get a sweet deal in the short term. That's not the issue. The issue is what's that sweet deal going to turn into in 3 or 5 or 10 years from now. And that's where I'm curious to see if there is going to be a day of reckoning. I don't know how it's all going to shape out, but I feel like it's almost like a nuclear arms race of who's really in charge here. Is it the tech vendors or is it the customers of the tech vendors? Who's really in charge of their businesses? And I don't know. It's fascinating. It's kind of an escalating, ratcheting up the tensions, I feel like, or the conflicts or the potential conflicts in the future between software vendors and their customers.
Yeah, absolutely. And what governance mechanisms are needed to monitor real-time consumption across APIs, AI workloads, and automation platforms like they're talking about?
Yeah, that's where it gets tricky because, the software vendors are not, they're probably playing, they're probably rolling the dice and assuming that most customers are not going to audit their subscription costs. If you're getting charged by number of AI agents and the number of API calls, who has time to go look and make sure that they're charging you the right amounts, but yet you're going to pay the bill every month? Because if you don't pay the bill every month or every quarter, they're going to shut off your access and you can't run your business. So I don't know. It's pretty unhealthy the way we're headed. I think it's unhealthy for customers. Again, it's really good for vendors. And if I intentionally don't invest in technology vendors just because of our independence as a company. I don't invest in any of the big tech providers that we work with just because I don't want there to be any subconscious bias that I might have for any of these vendors. But if you are a tech investor, this is actually really good news. And I would advise people go invest in some of these companies because their stock prices are going to keep inflating. At some point, I think the bubble will burst. But for now, we're on the upward slope. So it could be a really good time to invest in technology. Investors love it. Tech vendors are loving it. The question is, will customers love it in the years to come? And I don't think they will.
For sure. And one last question with this: how can CIOs push vendors for clearer ROI models when AI-driven pricing bundles lack transparent performance or productivity outcomes?
Yeah, and I'll add to that. They make it super easy for you to set up new agents for that reason, because you could have Sam from procurement just set up a couple agents because he wants to use it in his department to do his job better. But Sam from procurement doesn't realize how much is inflating the annual cost. And that's what the vendors want. They want to make it as easy as possible for you to set up your own agents and to create more usage and consumption of the software because they can bill for it. So the transparency, it goes twofold. One is making sure you've got guardrails and governance in place and you've negotiated good terms with the upfront contractual terms and cost. But you also want to make sure that you put guardrails in place internally so that people aren't unknowingly driving up the cost of your software. And I think that's where the real risk is, because you can lose control of that pretty quickly if you don't.
Yeah, well, it is definitely super interesting and something we will definitely continue to talk about on the podcast. But I'm excited to get into today's conversation.
Me too. We're going to talk about how to get a digital transformation back on track that's gone sideways. How do you remediate it? How do you identify the risks? How do you get your way out of a jam? How do you understand whether or not you are in a bind? All that stuff we're going to talk about here in the next segment. We're going to have a deep dive conversation into that, how to get your digital transformation back on track. And then later in the show, we are going to talk about how to create a realistic project plan from the start so that you hopefully don't have to deal with these digital transformation troubles that we're going to talk about here in the next segment. So we've got a lot more to cover. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control.
How can you see into my eyes like open doors?
I'm excited to announce the release of our 2025 Digital Transformation Report. It's available now on the Third Stage Consulting website, www.thirdstage-consulting.com. This report gives you an unbiased, technology-agnostic insight to help you optimize your organization's projects for success. Get your copy today using the QR code in front of me or on our website.
I want to encourage you to read our Guide to Organizational Change Management. It's a free report or free guide that we published. It's one that I actually wrote that talks about best practices and lessons learned as it relates to change management. So as you know, on this podcast, we cover a lot of stuff related to the human sides of change, organizational change management, including training, communications, org design, all kinds of stuff as it relates to change management. So if you're trying to learn more about change management, or you're looking for more direction and ideas on how to get started on your change management strategy and your overall journey, be sure to check out this guide. You can read it by scanning the QR code on the screen in front of you, or in the links below for this particular podcast episode. You can find a link to take you to the page that'll allow you to register to go ahead and download that and read it for free. So be sure to check it out. It's the Guide to Organizational Change Management, written by yours truly. I hope you enjoy it. Let me know what you think, and hope you enjoy the rest of this episode.
Wake me up inside. I can't wake up. Wake me up inside. Call my name and save me from.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 251. My name is Eric Kimberling, here with Darian Chwialkowski. You can find new episodes of this show every Wednesday at transformationgroundcontrol.com. This show is sponsored by Third Stage Consulting, which is an independent and tech-agnostic consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world with their digital transformation journeys. It's produced by Major Tom Productions. If you'd like to collaborate with us on this podcast or any other content we create, please feel free to drop us a line. We've included contact information for Major Tom Productions below. So our conversation now, we want to dive into a conversation around digital transformations and how to remediate them when they've gone sideways. Too often organizations fail to recognize that there's risks in these projects and that they've run into problems until it's too late. And so that's what we want to discuss here today. I would love to hear from you what the biggest challenges that you're facing in your digital transformation today. So I'd love to hear your thoughts in the chat. I'm going to walk through today some steps on how to remediate a failed or troubled project. And I guess the first thing before I jump in, and again, I'll keep an eye on the chat to see what comments you have. What are the biggest challenges you've seen in your digital transformation experience, or perhaps you're going through one now and you'd like to share some experiences you have there. I'd love to hear your feedback. But one of the interesting things about digital transformations that maybe is good news and bad news is that most statistics peg failure rates of digital transformations right around 80%. And that's been a remarkably steady number over the last several years. So if you go back decades, actually, from when I first started my career in this space, I remember 80% being the published or the common number you would see from, Gartner or McKinsey or whoever would put out a study about digital transformation failure. In fact, I've done my own research over the years and found the same to be true. And what's interesting is that technology has advanced so much over the years. And in some ways, digital transformations in theory or on paper should be going a lot more smashingly than they are now. You would think that with better technology, better tools, more flexibility, more options, you would think that would lead to a higher success rate, but that just has not materialized. In fact, I would argue and submit to you that failure rates are actually increasing and are bound to continue increasing for the simple fact that the gap or the chasm between what organizations are capable of today versus what technology can do tomorrow, that gap is widening so greatly that it's creating a bigger chasm or a bigger jump that organizations need to make. And with that increased jump or that increased chasm comes increased risk and increased likelihood of failure. So it's not necessarily intentional. Obviously, the tech industry, I don't believe, is trying to make it more difficult to implement new technologies, but they're advancing so quickly and exponentially that organizations simply can't keep up. There's just too much inertia. There's too much slow movement at big organizations, especially. And that's not a bad thing necessarily. That's just how bigger organizations or organisms work. But the fact of the matter is how do we pivot when we run into trouble? I think the biggest challenge that organizations have in these digital transformations, and the biggest challenge that failures have often, is that they don't recognize the problems in time. They ignore the problems. Maybe they're just not aware. Maybe they have third parties that have a vested interest in seeing them continue down the same path of failure rather than succeeding. Because let's be honest, the ones that benefit if you fail, if you're an organization going through a digital transformation, the only ones that benefit are the third-party consultants. They actually benefit economically if you fail or if you struggle, because you're going to need more of their time and they're going to have to throw more bodies, more resources, and generate more revenue as a result. So that's the challenge that is sort of a conflict of interest in the digital transformation space. And I think that's a real problem that I don't have an answer to or a good solution for you, but that is the reality of it. So that's the context for digital transformation failure. And what I want to do today is share with you a bit more of a framework and just some steps to walk through to get your digital transformation back on track. And then just a couple early comments that we've gotten here from my question of what causes some of the challenges in your experience or in your opinion. Sheriff Ride from YouTube says recruiting the right people for the project is probably the biggest challenge. Spotting unrealistic delivery timelines promised by consulting firms is another one. Brilliant point. And in fact, if this topic or if this conversation were focused on how to avoid failure in the first place during the planning stages, that would be one of the things I'd say is the unrealistic timelines that technology consultants and vendors put in front of clients is oftentimes borderline ridiculous. The assumptions are inaccurate. They've lowballed the estimate to try and win the business, and they've tried to convince you that the project's going to be a lot easier than it really is. And that's a sales tactic. It works. It sells software, but what it does is it leaves the customers holding the bag at the end of the day with a troubled project. They've already bought the software. They're in knee deep into an implementation. By the time they realize that the project was never going to finish on time or on budget because the budget and plan were completely unrealistic. So really good point. I'm sure Friday I couldn't agree with you more. Here's a question that I'm going to table for now. It's a really good one, but I want to come back to it because we're going to pepper this throughout the conversation. But Christina on LinkedIn says, please tell us your opinion on how AI will affect system and digital transformation. And I'll come back to this, but I will say that AI, this is another great point, by the way, because AI, in theory, should be helping dramatically decrease the time and cost to do some of the technical activities related to a digital transformation. And this is a really interesting one because when you deal with these bigger consulting firms whose whole business model is based on that body shop mentality, in other words, the more bodies I can put on a project, the more hours I can bill, the more money I'm going to make. That's one of the conflicts of interest as well. And that I think, on one hand, you see these big consulting firms that are embracing AI and giving it lip service, but yet in our experience, what we're seeing is we're not seeing a material drop in the level of effort that's put into these projects. If anything, it's creating more opportunities or more excuses to put more bodies on the project because now we've got AI capabilities that the clients are trying to deploy. Therefore, we need more bodies, more people to help set up those AI capabilities. So we'll see over time if that changes. I think the market will demand it. In fact, there was an article, I believe it was based out of Europe. I might have the region wrong. I believe it was in Europe. And there was a company that had publicized or had a well-publicized situation where they went to, I believe it was PwC. If it wasn't PwC, it was one of the big four consulting firms. And they went to PwC and said, hey, we expect you to start sharing some of these cost savings that you're touting as a result of AI. We expect you to pass that on to us because we're not seeing a decrease in cost, but yet you're sitting here telling us about how great AI is and how you have all these unique AI tools. And that's something that we do with our AI tool, by the way, that we use at Third Stage Consulting. We have something called Mission Control AI. And the whole idea is to help automate and speed up some of the work that has historically been done manually by the big system integrators. And they don't necessarily like this model because it does two things. One is it reduces costs and reduces the need for rework and for manual documentation, manual analysis for all the work. I mean, you still have to have humans thinking and using their brains, of course, but a lot of the manual work that consulting firms have done in the past is at risk. And so we use that tool as a way for our clients to save money. But more importantly, what that AI tool does in our implementations with our clients anyway, is it puts the client back in charge. So in other words, they now are the focal point or the center of gravity around all the requirements definition or gathering that's come into the tool, all the information that's captured, all the deliverables that come out of it. Now all of a sudden the client is more in charge of the project and they have more ownership rather than looking, wondering what's going on behind the curtain with the big consulting firms, because historically they haven't been very transparent with what they do with their time, how they do the work, how efficient they are or aren't. And again, whenever you have a party or a contractor that you've hired that is actually incentivized to be inefficient and to spend as much time and money as possible, that's not their time and money, it's your time and money. That's a definite conflict of interest. So I think AI has a way, or will have a way over time if used appropriately. It will be a way for organizations to be more smart with how they use consultants and not having to be overly dependent on them. Other comments here that really good ones. What is the major outcome of digital transformation? That's a whole conversation. We could spend a whole session just on that one topic. So great question from Muslim on YouTube. The main outcome of digital transformation should be business value. But as we're discussing here today, most organizations can't get to that point because they can't even get the base functionality or the base operational stability they need out of these new systems. So on one hand, organizations, when they're being sold software solutions, they're sold this vision, this utopia of the way things could be. But in reality, what happens is they have so much trouble just automating what they already had that oftentimes organizations never get past that. They never get past that first phase or that base level of capability that leads them to spend a lot of money essentially just automating what they've already always done, and they don't get that business value either because they run out of budget, they run out of time, they run out of patience, they run out of enough employee morale to support the project, whatever the case may be. So there's a big disconnect between what the main outcome of digital transformation should be versus what it really is. And this is the age-old challenge that organizations have faced and that this industry has faced. And again, that's why we're talking today about what to do about it. How do we assess and identify those challenges? There's a great point or comment here from TD on YouTube from Atlanta, Georgia. TD says, major airline justifying ROI for initial security of funding. Our recent success in getting beyond that hurdle has come in showing a modular implementation plan. It's a great point. And when you say modular, I assume you mean phased, but I'd love to hear more about that if you're willing to share what you mean by modular implementation plan. But it sounds like you're saying some sort of incremental, not big bang, not all at once, but incrementally improving technology, which I think is a very smart way to de-risk the project. And I think you just answered the question for me before I asked it. So TD followed up on YouTube, says addressing very specific business challenges with obvious high value return, and then implementing parts of the larger system solution to realize quick and early value. So thank you for your feedback there. So great comments so far, great discussion, and thank you so much for sharing all your thoughts so far. And please keep the conversation going here in the chat while I get started on a couple of thoughts here. But the first step, if we're looking at the steps you would go through to get a project back on track, the first thing is to admit there's a problem. And this may sound like a no-brainer, but it is really interesting to me how organizational dynamics and organizational psychology can get in the way of common sense. And what I mean by that is a lot of times organizations have a few things that come together that converge to create this perfect storm of denial. And the reasons for that are, one is oftentimes organizations don't understand, they don't know what they don't know. They don't know what a digital transformation should look like. They don't know what a complete project plan looks like versus not. They don't know what a realistic project plan looks like. They don't understand that your software vendor is just one cog in the machine. They don't need to be, nor should they be, the ones owning and running the entire project. Yet that's how most organizations manage the projects, is they allow the software vendors and their implementation technical partners to be the ones to control the entire project. And I would submit to you that it should be you, the organization, that controls and owns the project. The software vendor is just one of many pieces of that overall program, and they need to be managed just as much as anyone. And in fact, I would argue they need to be managed more than anyone on the project, because they are the biggest culprit of cost overrun, time overruns, all that stuff. And so you need a overall PMO or program manager in place to manage everything. But the reality is most organizations don't know that, because they don't know what they don't know. They haven't been through projects like these often. You add to the fact a second factor, which is that people are generally excited for the project, especially early on. They want to move forward. They want to see progress. They want to believe and hope for the best. And when problems start to arise, it can be easy at least for a certain period of time, it can be easy to ignore those problems and keep the faith, keep the optimism, all that stuff, which is great. You don't want people to get demoralized, of course, but there's a fine line between optimism and blind optimism and pragmatic, realistic optimism. Those are very different things, and organizations just aren't good at finding that right balance. And then I'd say the third factor, which I think is the biggest problem, and the thing that drives me the most crazy about this industry, is that you have software vendors, you have technical implementation partners, you have tech consultants that fuel into that continue to make you believe things are fine when they're not. There's so many times we see remediation projects, a big part of our business. In fact, a majority of our revenue now as a company comes from troubled or remediation projects, including expert witness. So we do a lot of expert witness work where it's gotten so bad that it's gotten to a lawsuit phase, and we have to go in and do the forensic analysis of why the project failed. But setting that aside, the expert witness stuff aside, so much of our business now is remediation. And when you're doing these remediation projects, you go back and look at what went wrong. One of the early culprits, and it continues throughout the entire project, is you had a technology partner who's convincing you that everything is fine. And part of this is lack of knowledge, lack of understanding of the reality of business, because a lot of these tech consulting firms are so myopically focused on deploying technology that all they can see is through the lens of whether or not the technology works. And when I say works, I mean it works technically. It's sound, the workflows are working, the data flows, it's integrated to other systems, blah, blah, blah. All that stuff is great. That doesn't mean it's going to work for your business. It could be a complete unmitigated disaster, even if they've done a great job designing and building the software from a technical perspective, because they don't understand your business. And what's even worse is that they're not the ones that have to live with the operational consequences of a failed project. Again, they could deliver a working system that meets all the technical specifications, but you can't run your business. And for the first few weeks after go live, you just can't ship product, or you can't close the books, you can't run payroll. And it's not because the software doesn't work, it's because it wasn't deployed effectively for your organization. All the exceptions weren't worked out, people weren't trained appropriately, all that stuff. So that third dimension, that third component of software vendors, technical implementers, those parties add to the confusion by trying to convince clients that everything is fine when in fact they're not. There's so many times we hear consulting firms, the technical consulting firms, that are really in CYA mode. It's like they're trying to protect their image, their perception, whatever, and they're trying to deflect blame, saying, "Hey, everything's going great. This is normal. Just relax." Because the last thing they want is for you to question enough to where you might stop the project, you might slow down the project, you might look for another system integrator because you're not happy with them, whatever it is. So they're always in CYA mode, especially the larger ones. And I came from that background. I came from a very large Big Four consulting firm back in the late 90s into the early 2000s. And I was part of that gamesmanship that would happen behind the scenes. And it's very crafty. I mean, it's very crafty. It's very effective. It's very deliberate. It's what I would say very conniving. It's very manipulative. And it's definitely designed to protect self-interest, which is completely counter to what clients need, which clients need to know that there's a problem. And again, it's not that you need to be overly negative. You don't want to create unnecessary alarm. You don't want people to get demoralized more than they might already be. But you also have to be smart and say, look, we've got some problems here and we've got to address them. We can't just stick our head in the sand and, trust the guy or gal who's the partner at the big system integration firm telling you that everything's fine. They're the experts, they know, when they've got nothing to gain by you being successful. I mean, it sucks to say, but they actually benefit. The longer they can milk this project, the longer they can extend it, get some more change orders, be there for you to clean up the problems that they created. They actually benefit from that. And that's the dynamic that we've got to watch. So admitting there's a problem is the first step. And what I would say is, if you're going through digital transformation, admit there is a problem. There probably is a problem that you're not aware of. So dig in and try and understand. And you do this in a way not based out of fear, but just based out of logic and using your brain and using common sense and saying, look, these are nasty, complicated projects, right? They're not fun. They're not easy. They never are. So let's just go in admitting that that's just what we signed up for. So now let's be realistic. Let's figure it out. It'd be like, if you're this is probably a bad analogy. I've never been a paramedic or a firefighter or anything like that, or a ER doctor. But if you're one of those people that are in business, or your profession is to help people out of trauma, or to help people from a fire, to put out a fire, whatever it is, it's not a bad thing to say there's a problem, there is a fire, or this person is in need of medical attention now. That's not a bad thing. That's a good thing to say, look, we need to fix this. We need to fix it now. We're not going to panic. We're not going to be unreasonably freaked out, but we are going to be smart about it. And we're going to try to address it. So admitting there's a problem is the first step. And again, denial is a very powerful thing. And it's one of the things that gets companies into trouble. So back to the audience here real quickly. Abul on LinkedIn says, hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today, Abul. TD on YouTube clarified my question earlier when I asked him to clarify what he meant by modular. So he said, yes, it's a phased approach. So thank you for that. Mohammed on LinkedIn says, for an on-premise ERP, what do you propose for an AI agent solution? AI agent using N8N or OpenAI agent, build your own on-premise AI integrated with our local database, ? Great question. I'm going to defer to anyone in the audience that might want to answer that, because I'm not a good, credible source of an answer for that as far as specific AI solutions or the specific architecture for AI. But I think it's a great question because, and I bring it up knowing I can't answer it. I brought it up anyway, because I figure someone in the audience might have some thoughts on it, but also because it's a great question and a great reminder that there are so many different ways to get AI that don't require you to necessarily rip out and replace your entire back office infrastructure. And when you look at the messaging from SAP, Oracle, Microsoft, all these big tech vendors, a lot of them are trying to convince you that you need to upgrade to their solution so that you can get AI. And, of course, that's another self-interest driven motive to say, hey, if we can get more people to completely sign up for our solution, not only the cloud solution that's our flagship, but also AI, then that's the utopia that software vendors want. But the reality is you have third-party options too. If you've got a legacy system that's working fine, but you want AI, then go find AI. There's ways to do that. And we've got clients that have done it. I just can't tell you the specific architecture or tools that each are using, but this is a really good question, and just it's a good question, a good line of thinking, because that's what more organizations should be doing. It's not, you don't necessarily need to say, okay, well, I'm going to go all in with SAP because they've got, Joule, their AI solution. So I'm going to upgrade S/4HANA and put in Joule just so I can get AI. You don't necessarily need that. If you're an existing SAP user, like an ECC user, and you don't want to upgrade S/4HANA, but you want AI, you can get AI without upgrading S/4HANA. In fact, I would argue that's the lower cost, lower risk, higher value path, because now you don't have to go through the heartache and all the heartburn of all the other crap that leads you up to maybe someday possibly getting AI if that project ever gets off the ground, because these projects are so challenging. So Bipin says on LinkedIn, Bipin says 1, acceptance of the problem, and 2 is user adoption. So yes, we will get to user adoption as well. Great points there, and I appreciate you sharing that. And here's a nice comment from B-Boy on YouTube. B-Boy says, sir, you are superb, outstanding. Your thought process and coaching content is just phenomenal. Thank you for that. I appreciate that. And any other thoughts or questions you have, I'd love to hear from you here. And so we talked about the first step, which is admitting there's a problem. And sounds basic enough, but like I said, most organizations don't do it very well, and most don't do it at all, I would say. But the next step is to assess the current situation. And this is where it gets tricky, because when we go into a client and they call us and they say, hey, third stage consulting, we need you to come in and take a look at this project because something doesn't feel right. We don't know what it is. We're being told one thing by the software vendor or by the system integrator, but things just aren't adding up in our heads, and we want you to come in and assess. Well, first of all, I'll say that when you bring in someone to assess, and when I say bring in someone, it could be someone internal, it could be a third-party consulting firm like us, it could be anyone you might bring in to assess a project. The technical vendors generally don't like that because they want to protect their turf. They view it as their projects. They've got their cash cow to protect. And this statement is true. The bigger company you are and the bigger revenue generator you are for the technical vendors, the more this is true, is that they're going to do whatever they can to protect that cash cow and that revenue stream. So if you're a bigger company, you're more at risk of seeing this, and those companies will fight super, super hard to make sure that companies like Third Stage Consulting stay the hell away, because the last thing they want is someone coming in and digging in and identifying problems and warts and things that aren't being done right, and things that are leading you, the client, astray, because they've got their own agenda that they're pursuing, their own self-interest agenda that they're pursuing. But you still need to assess the situation. I think this is where you've got to use a lot of finesse. I think this is something our team is really good at. We don't come in like a wrecking ball and start pointing fingers and throwing blame around or trying to threaten anyone's turf. Nothing like that. But there's a lot of defensiveness that comes along with troubled projects. A lot of protecting your image, the CYA, cover your ass mentality. And so again, that creates a bit of a smoke screen where it's hard to see past that. It's hard to see past, well, it doesn't feel right, but they're telling me this is normal. I get these status reports every week and everything's green. Yeah, there's a couple of yellows, but they say they've got it under control. That's what it says on paper on these status reports. But I look over here and what's happening on the front lines, and it looks like a complete disaster. Well, first of all, I'd say, again, back to my point number one, admit there's a problem, go with your gut. Chances are you're probably right, because usually there are challenges on these projects. And usually by the time you recognize that there are challenges, typically what we found is that the challenges and the issues and the risks are a lot greater than you realize. So if you're starting to feel like there's something there, chances are not only that you're right, but you're probably underestimating what those challenges really are and what the risks really are. So the finesse part of this comes in to play, where you've got to assess the current situation in a way that is transparent. I mean, you need to have complete transparency when you're doing these assessments. But the other tricky part is oftentimes when we do these, and most of the time, I'd say 80 or 90% of the time we do these current state assessments of the project, you don't want to stop the whole thing yet. And you may never want to stop the whole thing completely. You want to keep momentum going. You want to keep hitting milestones and keep going. And these current state assessments, by the way, should not be long. They should be quick hit, very fast, while the project's happening in parallel. Now, occasionally we'll get a client who has completely paused the project because they just know it's a complete disaster, and they'll pause it and then have us come in and figure out what the hell's going on and how do we fix it. But that's a minority of the time. Usually there's a problem in progress. It's not great enough necessarily to pause, but there's definitely not a sustainable path that they're on. So they'll try and figure out a way to keep everything intact as much as possible while this assessment is going on, while the current situation is being assessed. And so, you want to assess that current situation in a way that looks at all the different angles of the project. You also have to remember that if you decide you want the situation assessed, there's no one that should be able to tell you no, that it's not a good idea. They may try to, of course, but if your technology vendor is telling you it's not a good idea, you should not bring in someone or have someone do an assessment of the current situation. That is a huge, huge red flag. Why not? Like if you're doing a good job with this project, have at it. Bring in someone if you want. Good idea. Maybe if anything else validates how great of a job we're doing, and you're going to feel even more confident in our services. But that's not usually what happens. What usually happens is technology vendors feel threatened. They say, no, don't do this assessment. We've got this. We don't want too many cooks in the kitchen, blah, blah, blah. They'll give you a million reasons why you shouldn't do it. But you do need to assess the current situation. You need to do it in a way that doesn't disrupt the current project. And you need to do it in a way that is not overly threatening or more threatening than it's already going to be to not only your third-party providers, but also your internal team too. Your internal team presumably takes a lot of pride in the project. They want to do a good job. They want to be told they're doing a good job. So inviting someone to assess the project and tell them that maybe they're not doing a great job, that's just human nature. That can be threatening. So doing it in a way that's not threatening or any more threatening than it already is really important, but you do need to assess the current situation. As far as how you do the assessment of the current situation, we have a whole 13-point quality assurance framework that we use at Third Stage that we've developed over the years. And it's actually the same framework we use for our expert witness cases. In fact, that's where we developed it, is we developed this framework to analyze expert witness cases, to say these are the things that we need to analyze in a failed project to understand all the dimensions of a project, where the risks were and why they're contributing or how they're contributing to the failure. And we use that same framework when we're assessing current state projects as well, or assessing client projects that are in flight with their digital transformations. We'll use that same framework there as we do in expert witness. And the good thing with that is it's battle tested. It's been used in some pretty gnarly extreme failures. And so being able to bring that forward to a troubled project that hasn't quite gotten to that failure point yet can be very powerful in a very structured way of analyzing the project. Not only is it structured too, it's very objective. It's meant to be agnostic. It's meant to be not personal. It's just meant to be looking at the reality of what's going well, what's not, and what do we need to pivot on and improve or fix to put out some of the fires that you might be experiencing in these projects. So I can come back to the audience real quick and see what kind of questions you have here. James on LinkedIn says, is there a common theme with a specific enterprise system, such as SAP, Oracle, Dynamics, etc., often leading to increased likelihood of failure and delays? This is a great question. I get asked this a lot. And I do struggle a little bit to answer it because I have such mixed feelings on it. On one hand, I'll admit I'm a bit jaded with SAP and Oracle because, especially SAP, I mean, that's where you see most of the biggest, most gnarliest failures, the most expensive disasters in the history of enterprise tech typically involve SAP or Oracle. But take that with a grain of salt because by definition or by design, most of SAP and Oracle's customers are really big companies that if they're going to fail in their projects, they're going to fail spectacularly because they're such big companies, and you're going to see huge price tags like hundreds of millions of dollars, in some cases over $1 billion spent and lost on a failed digital transformation. And when it's a publicly traded company or a public institution that people have heard of, you're just going to hear about it more, and it's a lot more likely to be a big deal than the average, small mom and pop manufacturing shop down the street that no one's ever heard of. And it is not going to fail nearly as spectacularly, but for them, relatively speaking, it can still be a complete disaster and enough to, in some cases, put them out of business. But generally, you don't hear about that in the same way you hear about the big SAP and Oracle failures. So that's the caveat I'd say is yes, there are, I'd say, more big dramatic SAP and Oracle failures than anything, but I couldn't tell you how much of that is due to the software as it is the nature of the customers. I will say, though, that the problem with SAP and Oracle, and I'd say this is just as a broad generalization, it's not always true, but as a broad generalization, the bigger the technical vendor you're working with, the more likely it is that they're not going to have a bad product necessarily. They probably have a better project. I mean, you could argue that SAP has one of the best ERP systems in the world. I know many of you will agree with that, and I'm sure many of you will strongly disagree with this. And I'm not here to talk about the merits of SAP versus Oracle versus Dynamics, but what I will say is that the problems that happen in a big SAP project are not nearly as much related to the technology itself as it is the nature of the way those projects are managed. And a lot of the dynamics I just talked about with big SAP partners who have a big cash cow to protect, it creates a ton of really unhealthy, destructive behavior that leads to failure more commonly not because the software sucks or because the system can't handle what the client needs, but because of all the other stuff I just mentioned, all that the conflicts of interest, the gamesmanship that goes into protecting turf and protecting cash cows and things like that. That's the stuff that leads to failure. And so again, that's more of a function of the fact that these are big organizations that have created a juggernaut of a sales engine to basically sell as much software as possible. We're here discussing how to remediate a digital transformation that's gone sideways. We've got a lot more to cover. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control.
I met her in a club down in Old Soho, where you drink champagne and it tastes like Coca-Cola.
If you're about to embark on the jungle of digital transformation, check out my new book, Welcome to the Jungle. It's a book that just came out in late 2025. It's my second book, and it's a book that focuses on digital transformation failure case studies and talks about the lessons and takeaways from that. It's 300 pages packed of all the lessons and things that I've learned from having been an expert witness in lawsuits related to digital transformations, and also with our team helping clients recover some of their failed projects. I've included as many lessons as I could possibly fit into one book here. You can read this book. You can order it anywhere in the world in hard copy format, which is this format here. You can get it in paperback. You can also get it electronically as well. Scan the QR code right here or go to the links below for your copy. Hope you enjoy it. Let me know what you think.
Are you looking for ways to promote your product or service to enterprise technology decision makers and influencers throughout the world, like the ones who listen to this podcast? Major Tom Productions creates media, events, and influencer marketing for B2B technology providers. Our productions are exciting, educational, disruptive, and effective. Most importantly, they create results. Our content is unlike any other in this industry, engaging, influential, and trusted by technology buyers and influencers throughout the world. Each month, our productions reach hundreds of thousands of targeted buyers and decision makers who trust and engage with our honest and tech agnostic content. With long tail viral results and engagement with our content, Major Tom Productions provides a way to reach your target market and create awareness, calls to action, and a connection with potential customers. So, collaborate with us today. Learn how we can feature your product or service on podcasts such as Transformation Ground Control, Journey to S4HANA, and Journey to Dynamics 365. We can also feature your brand on our YouTube channel called Digital Transformation with Eric Kimberling, which boasts over 100,000 subscribers and over 2 million video views per year. You can also participate in our in-person events, including our Digital Stratosphere Conference. Contact us today to learn more. We can tailor a marketing campaign that works for you. We look forward to helping more people learn more about and become engaged with your brand.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 251. My name is Eric Kimberling here with Darian Chwialkowski. You can find new episodes of this show every Wednesday by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com. The podcast is produced by Major Tom Productions and sponsored by Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent tech agnostic consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world with their digital transformation journeys. And we're here talking about how to remediate a digital transformation that's gone sideways. Lake says, whoa, my favorite topic. ECC equals expose you, APA, aka OData services, and use third-party AI models and agents. Believe me, it's your best option if you can't justify the ROI on an S4HANA upgrade. So Lake has a couple solutions there that might be good alternatives. And then here's a really interesting question from Amar. Amar says, is there a way to prepare for a rescue plan from day zero? It's a great point. I don't know that I would necessarily call it a rescue plan from day zero because there's nothing to rescue yet, and you don't want to necessarily prematurely worry the masses, if you will. If you're an executive, sure, let's talk about this behind closed doors. That yes, this is going to be challenging. It's going to be gnarly. You probably will have to rescue some things, but that's generally not the message you lead with when you're trying to convince your team and your broader support system on the project. You don't want to. You want them to be realistic. You want to be realistic and let them know what they're getting into, but you don't want to freak them out too much. So it's a tricky thing. So I wouldn't necessarily say it's a rescue plan, but it's more of a risk mitigation plan from day zero. So the key here is how do you set up objective, transparent, and realistic risk mitigation from day zero? That's the trick here. And the dynamic that you're touching upon here, Amar, is that, again, in true CYA fashion, if I'm the vendor, if I'm the technical implementer, if I'm the system integrator, I'm probably more likely to put a status report out that has way too much green on it and not nearly enough yellow and red. Red, yellow, green, being green's good. Green means things are on track. Red means we've got problems. We've got to fix these right away, et cetera, because it's almost like a scorecard that you're doing for yourself in many cases. And this is where the saying, you don't want the fox guarding the hen house, because it'd be like in school. It'd be like when you were in school or university, there's a reason that you're not asked to grade your own homework or your own test results. You could, that might, save the university money if you did do that, but there's a reason they don't. But yet as corporations, we rely on the information, the self-assessment information provided by our vendors and our system integrators, which is a huge problem, because in that situation, you're going to get green status reports, and they create a false sense of security that's not true. And I'm not saying everything needs to be yellow and red and the sky is falling and it's doomsday scenario from day one, but you need to identify those risks before you feel them, before they become obvious to you. And what we view with our clients and the way we look at it is we want to be the ones to help them see around the corner what's coming next before they run into it. If you run into it, it's too late usually by the time you get to the problem or by the time the problem materializes to the point where you see it and feel it. Generally speaking, you've gone too far, you've waited too long at that point. So we've talked about 2 steps so far. We talked about admitting there's a problem. We talked about assessing the current situation. And then the next thing we need to do is we need to prioritize the risks and issues. And if you are anything beyond, actually, I'll take it back. If you are anywhere in your digital transformation journey right now, and I mean anywhere, if you're on day 0, if you're just a few weeks, a few months into it, or if you're just about to start your digital transformation, if you haven't identified risks and issues and started to see some signs of yellow and maybe even some signs of red, there's something you're missing. You're not seeing the full picture. You're not seeing below the tip of the iceberg right now. And so there's going to be risks and issues. That's not really a debatable fact, in my opinion. You are going to have risks and issues no matter who you are, no matter what vendor or partners you're working with. I'd love to say, even if you hire third stage, though, you'll have no risks or issues. You're going to have risks and issues no matter who you hire. The question is, how quickly do you recognize them? How do you prioritize them? And how do you mitigate them? And so prioritizing the risk and issues is important because oftentimes the further you are into the project, the bigger this list is. And oftentimes we go into these projects and there's 100 things that you should be doing differently and better. You should have done from day one, but you didn't. And you should fix all 100 of these things. Well, the reality is you're probably not going to fix all 100 of them anytime soon. So let's pick the 10 or 20 that are going to have a huge impact to at least stabilize things, at least get us on the right track to where we can then work our way down the list and start chipping away at some of the other challenges. And so prioritizing those risks and issues, and again, doing this in an objective way is really important because, again, the dynamic we see in these sorts of projects is that oftentimes the technical vendor will, even if let's just say they do identify the risk or they agree that there is a risk, oftentimes what they'll do is they'll understate or underestimate the significance of that risk. Something like, well, yeah, half the team isn't trained yet, but that's okay. That's normal. Most of the learning comes after go live anyway. Something like that. On the surface, maybe you think, okay, well, maybe that's true. Maybe that's just the way things should be. And so maybe it's really a yellow and it's not a red. It's just more of a yellow. It's something to be aware of, but it's fine. We've got it under control. Well, it could be that, if half your team isn't trained and you're going live next week, I would say that is absolutely double, triple red status. And so you want to objectively prioritize those risks and issues and be realistic about it. And again, having a third party assess those risks in a way that isn't grading your own homework is really important because you, the end client, have to be aware. And you could decide that maybe you don't think it's as big of a risk, but if you consciously decide that yourself and you make a smart, objective business decision, that's fine. That's different. And we're used to that as consultants. We're used to the business realities of you have a business to run. You can't address every single thing that should be done in a project, but you at least need to know what they are. And you at least need to make a risk adjusted decision with full information. And that's the key right there, is that most of the time executives are making these decisions without complete or unbiased information. So very important thing to keep in mind there. Darian on LinkedIn asked the question, what is the first step when your gut says something is wrong? Well, great question. I'd say the first step is to validate that something probably is wrong. And again, think that it's probably worse than you think. If you're feeling it, chances are super high that there's something there. And so dig into it, listen to your gut, dig into it. Doesn't mean you need to, throw the baby out with the bathwater and call a timeout on the whole thing or whatever, but just be smart about and deliberate and really dig into what that is and get that objective view of what in fact might be wrong with the project. So great question there. Here's a comment from Derek on YouTube, joining from Port of Spain, Trinidad and Tobago. Thank you for being here today, Derek, on YouTube. So those are We talked about step 1, admit there's a problem. 2, assess the current situation. 3, prioritize the risks and issues. And then step 4 is develop a remediation strategy and plan. And this may seem straightforward enough, but again, the key here is that if you've done your analysis objectively and you've prioritized the risks objectively, now you should be able to develop a remediation strategy and plan that starts to address those things. And oftentimes, just to give you examples, some things that will happen are some common things we'll see here is that one really common one is you're not investing enough in change management. You're not getting your people on board beyond just showing them how to use a new system. You need to more fundamentally focus on how you're helping people through the change by ensuring that they understand what their jobs are going to look like, that you take the time to define what their jobs are going to look like, what their roles and responsibilities are going to be in the new system, in the new environment. And that's something that, is interesting how it doesn't get done often. It definitely doesn't get done early enough in most cases, but it's one of those pains or those risks that you don't really see and feel until after go live. And that's a really bad time to feel it. And what I mean is that, like, you could go through this competency training, you train everyone on how to use a new system. Let's just say you're implementing Microsoft Dynamics 365. You've gone through and 98% of your people have passed the competency test, assuming you're measuring the competency levels. People can complete transactions in the system, but then you go live and all of a sudden people aren't doing it. And it's not about competency. It's about whether or not they want to, and whether or not they understand, whether or not they can merge how to use a system with their day-to-day jobs. And that's a totally different thing. Knowing how to complete a series of tasks and transactions in a system is not what it takes to do my job. And what it takes to do my job is to understand, like, how am I going to use AI? Like, okay, I know how you train me on how to enter certain prompts or whatever, but what does that mean for me and my job? Just so taking the time to really do that job design, that work design, and help people understand what the changes are, helping them work through the shock and the concern that they might have, and they probably will have with the changes of their job. That's all really important. And that's just one example. Anything to do with change management, that's commonly an issue that we see with remediation strategies. Oftentimes we see that there's a lack of accountability on the projects with your third-party vendors. So in other words, a lot of times people will they're not holding their vendors accountable. They're not managing their vendors. They're letting the vendors manage the project. And guess what? It's not their money. So sure, they want to manage it because if they can manage the project, they manage their own cash flow. So it's almost like not a cartel situation, although I do think the tech industry as a whole is like a cartel, but that's not the word I'm looking for here. But having someone who manages and controls your cash and how you spend your time and money and resources is a problem. So you've got to, oftentimes the remediation strategy and plan entails managing your vendor and putting accountability and guardrails in place for the vendor. And guess what? They're not going to like that. But for most of you, if not all of you, that's something you absolutely have to do, or else your project will run into problems. It just will. It's human nature. It's conflicts of interest. It's greed. It's self-interest. All these things add up into a situation where there's only one person who's going to lose, and it's going to be you, the end client. So that's something that's super important to recognize in these projects. And so developing that remediation strategy and plan is something that's critical. And you want to make sure you do that as quickly as possible. Here's a comment from Amar on LinkedIn. Amar says, generally, by the time one realizes that a project is going off track, the budget has already been largely consumed. How can this be prevented? Great question. Yes, unfortunately, most organizations wait until they've blown through the budget. They've blown past a series of milestones, and it becomes painfully obvious that we've got a problem and it's not going well. And so the key is to take responsibility, take ownership of your project from day one. Do not, and I can't emphasize it enough, do not let your system integrator or your software vendor manage the project for you. You are the project manager. You are the program manager. You are the PMO. They are one piece of that overall program. They report to you. You tell them how it's going to be. They've got their plans of what they think they need to do. They've got their tools and methodologies of what they think they need to do. You are the ones that decide whether or not and how you're going to deploy those vendors. And just to give you an example, if you've got a software vendor that says, and actually we have a client who's going through an SAP project, they're just ramping it up right now, and it's with not a huge big four consulting firm, but it's a solid, larger, mid-tier SAP implementer. The client signed the contract with them, and the amount of pressure that this implementer put on them to staff the project with 30 full-time resources ASAP was just unbelievable to me. Before the client had their own team in place, before the client had their ducks in a row, before they even knew what the full scope of the project was, this vendor was saying, hey, we need to start our team of 30 full-time people in 2 weeks, or else this project is at risk. And that's how they get you, is they'll tell you, well, you want to hit your timeline, right? You want to finish this on budget, right? Well, you better let us throw a bunch of bodies at it. And again, if and when you don't get the budget anyway, because you've wasted and burned a lot of time with unnecessary resources too early in the project, again, the only one that's hurt by it is you, and the person that benefits is actually the person who convinced you to do something that hurts you. So again, if that's not a conflict of interest, I don't know what is, but that's the dynamic you have to watch for. And so you don't want to wait until the project gets over budget. You want to put guardrails and PMO, program governance in place, and management of the system integrator early on, because it's a lot harder to change that later. If you let them do what they want and run amok with the project, 6, 12, 18 months into the project, it's really hard to undo that. So you can, because you're a business. If you need to fire them, you can, or whatever, but that's a little dramatic. You might as well just work through that expectation setting early on from day one, so that you can objectively see the time and money that's being spent on projects. So that's what I would say, is manage the project, put a PMO in place. And if you don't have your own internal PMO, get it from the outside, get someone who's objective, that's not affiliated with the technology or the software vendor, because again, they're the ones that are going to consume and suck up all the time and money, when in fact, a lot of that time and money should be dispersed to other work streams, things like change management and training and the architecture and integration of other systems. Maybe you have third-party systems you want to deploy. You need to make sure that you're deploying capital and resources and time appropriately throughout the program, not letting one vendor within the overall program suck up all that time and money that doesn't benefit you at all. So we've talked about 4 steps so far. There's 1 step left. And well, it's not really a step. I talked about how you develop a remediation strategy and plan. You're not going to boil the ocean overnight. You're not going to fix everything overnight. You want to make sure you're getting to the root causes of what's really causing the problem. And it could lead to, a whole spectrum or a whole continuum of options. It ranges from, hey, we're just got, minor little incremental improvements we want to make to slowly get this thing back on track. In some cases, it could be more extreme than that. And that's the 5th thing that I'll talk about, is that don't be afraid to pause or stop the project. It is somewhat of a last resort. I wouldn't suggest it as a going in strategy or as a option A. But for some of you, it may be that you do need to pause or stop the project, even if it's just temporarily, even if it's for 30 days while you get your house in order, while you reorganize the team, while you reorganize the plan, recast the plan. The last thing you want to do is find that, we've got all these problems and we're going down this path that's the complete wrong path. We're just going to keep doing it, and we're just going to keep blowing money and bleeding money out this way, knowing that we've got to pivot and go this other direction. So for some organizations, when it's that extreme, where you are completely off track and your vendor's off doing their own thing, and you've got to redirect them, sometimes you just have to pause it, and they will absolutely kick and scream and resist that so heavily, because again, they've got a cash cow to protect. And if they've put 30 or 50 full-time people on this project, that's 30 or 50 people now they've got to figure out what to do with. And of course, they're going to tell you, don't do it. We may not get these resources back, and you'll lose all that tribal knowledge, and we'll lose all the momentum we built. Well, it doesn't matter if the momentum and the tribal knowledge was taking you down the wrong path anyway. So you can set that aside. That's a non-issue. But there are times where you may need to pause the project, and a good partner will understand that. And a good partner will actually help you through that and encourage you to do that, to make sure you get things right. a self-interested partner will say, don't do it. Keep, hold the course, just hang in there. This is normal. Everything's fine. Because again, their stopgap and their solution is a change order. All they need to do is say, well, yeah, things are going to be fine. We just need a change order to fix it. And you shouldn't be the one paying for your vendor's mistakes or their lack of accountability for the project. So, I think that's the key. And it's really not about stopping or pausing the project. I think the point here is much, much bigger than this. And it's a point I made a few minutes ago. And that is you are in control of your project. I know, it may sound, as I say it, it sounds like such common sense. Of course, it's your project. It's your company, right? You're the one putting in new technology to do something to improve your business. Of course, you're in charge of it. But the tech industry has done a really good job of selling software by creating these weird codependent learned helplessness sorts of relationships with customers, to where, again, they benefit the more helpless you are, and they benefit the harder the project is for you, the more they benefit. And they're really good at convincing you that, hey, it's fine. It's almost like they're gaslighting you into believing that everything's fine. Maybe you're the problem. I mean, they're not. You just need to get your shit together, and then everything will be fine. But they're good. Everything they're doing is fine. You just need to find more people, or do your deliverables faster. And so there are times, though, you need to pause or stop the project. There's times where you may need to fire your system integrator and say, this is not working. You need someone that's smaller, more nimble, someone who's a little more focused, someone who's not going to blow your budget so quickly. You may need a focus on other work streams that you've neglected this whole time. So it could be that, the tech stuff is moving along fine. The design and build is moving along fine, but all the other stuff's falling behind as far as the integration of other systems, the integration testing, the training, the change management, the process improvement. If those are the cases, then, or if that is the case, then don't keep spending money at the current run rate while you're trying to fix those things, because you're just wasting more money. The other option too, beyond just stopping the project, by the way, is that you can also slow it down. And that's something we've seen several clients do very effectively over the years, is that, if let's just say, just for round number purposes, you're spending $1 million a month on a project, and you're assuming a 18-month implementation, it might be that, it's actually more like a 24-month implementation. So we're going to throttle that back to, $700,000 a month. And by the way, vendor and system integrator, we need you to cut back your resources and right size your delivery of the project. And of course, they'll kick and scream and tell you that's a bad idea. You shouldn't do it. We can get it done in 18 months. Just trust us. If you just let us do our job, you're not going to get it done in 18 months. It's going to be 24 or whatever the number is. So just right size your project accordingly. Doesn't matter that they staffed it up heavier at one point. You might have to scale it back. In fact, ideally, you do that from day one. You start off slow, and if you need to add more bodies, then sure, add bodies. But it's a lot easier to add bodies as you go and start slow and start smart than it is to throttle back and reverse course later. So, but having said that, in some cases, not being afraid to stop the project, pause it, completely right size it, downsize the project and the run rate if need be. And it's not about whether or not you want to go faster or slower. A lot of times it's just you can't. And if you can't, then don't spend money and go at that run rate, assuming you're going to hit some aggressive timeline that you just never going to hit. Because guess what? That run rate's going to continue into perpetuity until you do finish, which could be 25, 50, 75% beyond what they originally promised you. So those are some of the things to keep in mind as you go through these sorts of projects. So those are the steps I've got for you here today. Love to hear any feedback you have, any other comments you have. But those are the things to keep in mind when you're trying to rescue a digital transformation. I know there's a lot to think about. I'd love to hear your comments or feedback as far as what you've seen work best, or some of the challenges you're facing with your project right now. I know there's a lot of you that are going through these projects, and maybe you're struggling with in some parts of the project now. Maybe you're not sure. But I think the key here, the main takeaway I'd leave you with is first of all, you're not crazy. If you're running into trouble and you're having issues with your digital transformation, you're not crazy and you're not alone. So that's the good news. You're actually in the majority. Most companies going through these projects have that problem. And in fact, whenever we do these mastermind groups or we get together our clients, our C-level clients to collaborate or just to meet, or when we do our stratosphere events in person, one of the biggest values that in those events that we find isn't the knowledge and the wisdom that we impart on our clients, although I'd love to say that's the most valuable, important thing. It's not. What's even more important is just being around people like yourselves that are going through the same thing, realizing, oh, they're struggling with a lot of the same things, and I'm not crazy. And a lot of times I actually get that comment a lot from clients, especially new clients. They'll say, I can't tell you how many times I've heard the comment like, Eric, or Third Stage, you must think we're crazy. Are you sure you want to work with us? And we look at it as like, you're actually not crazy at all. And that's the only crazy thing in this industry, is that it's not crazy. It's normal, which that's a whole nother conversation for a whole nother time. I think it's a very broken industry that stacks the odds against customers. And I don't know of necessarily of any other industry where you could say that. If anyone has a good example, I'd love to hear it, because I've struggled for 25 years to find an industry where the entire thing is stacked to basically harm customers, not intentionally, but it's the way it's designed. It does harm customers, and it benefits the tech industry really well. I mean, look at the valuations of all these companies I've mentioned here today. They have incredible valuations on the stock market. Their stock prices are high, especially SAP and Oracle. They're doing really well financially. I mean, they are living the dream, but their customers are not. And there's so many customers for these same high valued tech companies. They're miserable right now. They're bleeding cash. They're going through extreme operational hardship as a result of failed or failing digital transformations. And so some people say I'm too negative when I say that stuff. I just think it's the reality. It's unfortunately, it's why I do what I do, is because I want to help clients figure this out for themselves and help them get through it, because it doesn't need to be this way. But the way the ecosystem was built for each of these big software vendors, it was built to sell a massive amount of software, and it is highly scalable. Investors love it. They get rewarded for it. And even when they do fail, they get rewarded for it through additional services. So it's the only industry I can think of where there's a actual pretty significant financial incentive to harm your clients, even if it's not intentional. So that's the bad news. The good news is it's your project, your company, your project. Do what you need to do. If you want to talk to me or anyone from our team, even if it's informally, just want to bounce around ideas, feel free to reach out. I'd be happy to chat with you at any point and give you some ideas on how to get your project back on track. Love to share our experiences with you as well. So be sure to do that if you'd like. I've included my contact information below. And also one other thing, I have a book out now called Welcome to the Jungle. It's my second book. And in that book, I talk about digital transformation failure case studies and the lessons from those digital transformations, so that you can get those projects back on track. So you can find that on Amazon anywhere in the world you are. You can get it electronically, or you can get hard copy paperback versions of the book anywhere in the world. So be sure to order that right here. Scan the QR code, or if you just go to Amazon, search my name, Welcome to the Jungle. There's like a kid's book called Welcome to the Jungle, but other than that, I think mine's the only one called that on Amazon. But you can find that there, and it's I'm proud of it. I think it's a good book that talks a lot about some of the high profile failures in digital transformations. And as you read the book, the idea is that you start to see the same patterns over and over and over again. And it doesn't matter what era we're talking. We could have been talking about a failure in the 90s. We could have been talking about a failure this year. And the patterns and the failure points and the mistakes organizations make has not changed, in my opinion, over the last 25 years. So that book really outlines what these big companies do wrong, the things they could have and should have done, and the things you certainly can do to avoid failure in the first place. So be sure to check that out. Welcome to the Jungle, my second book. So be sure to check that out. All right, good stuff. Well, thank you to the audience for such great questions and such good engagement on that discussion. Really appreciate the really enlightening questions and comments there. We've got a lot more to cover. We're going to debrief on the conversation we just had in just a moment, but we're also going to get into how to create a realistic implementation plan for your technology project. And that's something we'll get to here in just a moment. But first, we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with more Transformation Ground Control.
Hey, feeling good, like I should. When in Durga, walk around the neighborhood, feeling blessed.
I want to share a little bit of information about Third Stage Consulting and who we are. Third Stage Consulting Group is an independent technology agnostic provider of consulting services to help clients through their digital transformations. We help with digital strategy and software selection, as well as implementation planning. And during implementation, we provide services related to program management, organizational change, business process improvement, as well as enterprise architecture. These are just some of the services we provide. We have offices in North America as well as Europe and Asia Pacific. So if you'd like to learn more, I encourage you to check out our resource center, which includes a number of resources that will help you through your digital transformation, and you can access that for free using the QR code here or the links below. You can also reach out to me directly if you'd like to discuss your digital transformation and brainstorm ideas on how to improve where you're headed on your journey.
The last thing you want to have happen is for your digital transformation to end up in court. I've been doing this for 20 years and I have seen everything. My name is Marcus Harris. I'm a software and technology attorney focusing my practice on drafting and negotiating software-related contracts and litigating software disputes across the country. Feel free to reach out to us at taftlaw.com. We'd love to talk to you about the litigation process and what you can expect.
Feeling good, like I should. When in dark, walk around the neighborhood. Feeling blessed, never stressed. Got that sunshine on my.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 251. This is Eric Kimberling here with Darian Chwialkowski. And Darian, we just had the discussion around digital transformations gone sideways and how to remediate them. What were some of your thoughts and takeaways from the conversation?
Yeah, like you said, it was a great conversation. I thought the audience had a lot of great points and questions throughout the conversation. I have a couple of follow-up questions, I guess, to add as well. One being about risk mitigation. So what should a day zero risk mitigation plan include without scaring the organization from that day zero of the project?
Well, I think the first thing is to condition the internal team and the overall team to think about risk and to understand that there's risks, and that the sooner we identify these, the sooner we can solve them and fix them and keep them from getting out of control. And so conditioning the team to think in terms of not just optimism and excitement, but also risk is really important. And so I think the sooner you do that, the easier it is. Where it becomes difficult is when you start introducing all these risks that people didn't know about. They're always there, just people didn't know. And then you introduce them all at once, halfway through the project, then that freaks people out. And that's more jarring and more startling to these teams than anything. It may be that that's where you're at and you have to do it, but it's a lot better just to identify those risks early on and get people used to it. Because if they start thinking and hearing you as a team and as a leadership team talking about, like, here's what we're going to do, here's the decision we're making, here's the downside risk that we're taking by making this decision, here's the upside potential, here's why we're making that decision, then they start to understand that, okay, there are risks. The net benefit is still positive, but there are risks that we want to mitigate. We can't let the risks outweigh the positives, so let's mitigate those risks. Then it's a lot less threatening to people then versus introducing those risks later or exposing the risk later once people have already invested their heart and soul into the project, and then they feel like that's an indictment on the work they've done, when in reality, most of the time, the risks were always there, just no one knew about them or no one was telling them that the risks were there. So I think the sooner you can introduce that risk-based mentality into the project, that's probably the biggest thing that you can do.
For sure. And then a follow-up on the kind of like the budget, timeline, and illusion of control portion of the conversation. How do you avoid burning cash on the wrong activities while neglecting critical ones like OCM and integration?
Great question. It happens all the time too. Well, the first thing is the thread that we were talking about how you have to control the vendor. You have to take control of the project. You have to control the vendor. If you need to right size the vendor's team, or if you need them to throttle back or slow down the run rate or slow down the level of effort and the speed at which they're going, so that you can invest and divert more attention to the more important fundamental things like change management or integration or whatever it is, then do it. And so I think that's the first step, is don't let the vendor convince you that 90% of your budget or whatever should go to them, because they're just one of many work streams in a project. In fact, I'd say, even with software and services, the total, if you look at your total budget of a project, well less than half of that should be going to your vendor for both software and services. If you're spending more than half just for the vendor, then something's off. That means they're just sucking up your time and resources because it benefits them. You need to figure out a way to right size that and invest in the things that matter the most.
For sure. And one last question to kind of wrap up the conversation altogether. What advice would you offer to teams who feel alone in their ERP challenges?
Well, first of all, just know that you're not alone. And if you want me to put you in touch with others that are struggling with the same thing, reach out to me. I'll put you in touch with them. You can join one of our mastermind groups. You can join our webinar series, whatever the case may be. There's a lot of ways to feel less crazy. And the more you can network with people that are going through similar projects, I think the better you'll feel. You'll start to share stories that sound eerily similar to what you're experiencing. And sure, I'm sure there's nuances, or there might be weird nuances that only you are experiencing. But for the most part, I'd say 80 or 90% of what you're feeling and experiencing is probably pretty common, which is both good news and bad news. So I'd start there. I mean, just to, reach out to me. I'll put you in touch with other team members that can compare notes and just share their war stories. Continue listening. This podcast, we try to get clients of ours on here to talk about their experiences, listen to what other people say. Don't buy into the vendor Kool-Aid too much, because that's where the disconnect happens, or the dissonance happens, is you start to feel crazy because you start hearing you've been hearing the vendors talk about how awesome everything is and how great everything is for however long. And then you go into the project and it's not as awesome as they say. And you start to feel like, well, it doesn't feel right, because I was told all along that this was going to be awesome. It's so easy. We've got accelerators. We've got SaaS cloud solutions that are going to be so awesome, but yet here we are in a train wreck of a project. Something doesn't feel right. It must be me. I must be the problem. It's not you. You might be doing things, your team might be doing some things that aren't helping, but chances are pretty high that you're going through some pretty normal stuff. You just don't know how to mitigate that risk, and no one is advising you in a trustworthy way on how to get out of those binds. So that'd be my advice to those that might feel crazy.
Yeah, for sure. That's great advice for sure. And what a great conversation today with all the audience and with you.
Yeah, that was great stuff. And enjoyed all the questions we got from the audience. So thank you for that. We've got one more segment we want to get to here now, which is how to create a realistic project plan. And one of the big disconnects that organizations have, speaking of disconnects, a lot of what we're talking about here, by the way, it all gets back to expectation setting and alignment between reality and what people perceive. And that typically starts in the planning stage of a project. You get a project plan or proposal from a software vendor that makes things look like it's going to be a lot easier than it is. It looks like a realistic project plan. You get into the project and suddenly you've spent 2 or 3 times as much time as you thought or were convinced you could or should spend, and you wonder why. And so that's a disconnect or a mismanaged expectation that starts right away. And it's not usually the fault of execution. It's a fault of expectation setting up front. So for example, if there's a project that was always going to take 24 months, but somehow a vendor convinces you they can do it in 12, the 12 wasn't ever real. That was never a real number, but yet you staked your entire plan, your budget, expectations on that 12-month horizon. And then everyone's surprised and freaked out and disappointed when it actually takes 24 months, but it was always going to take 24 months. So, just get to the reality now rather than waiting until you're through the project. So I want to do in this video segment, and this is from a video I published on my YouTube channel, it talks about, and I whiteboard out why that disconnect happens and how you can get that disconnect figured out up front when you're planning for the project so that you don't get surprised by it later. So let's go ahead and roll the clip and then we'll come back and talk about it. Most plans look something like this, but most in reality end up looking like this in terms of duration. That also applies to your budget as well. And the reason for this isn't a secret. It shouldn't be this way. If you go into the project planning process with your eyes wide open and you understand what all the variables are, this should never happen. You might have slight variances, but you should not have something that takes twice as long or 3 times as long as what you originally planned for. But yet, that's what happens with most digital transformation and technology projects. So what I want to do today is talk about what is it that leads us from an unrealistic plan to reality so that this actually becomes the green line that we plan for to ensure that we've included all the different components. Now, if you'd like to learn more about successful projects and what you need to do to be successful, you can learn from over 1,000 different digital transformation projects in recent years by reading our ebook called Lessons from 1,000 Digital Transformations. You can find that by scanning the QR code right here or go to the links below. Now, the first reason, and arguably the most important reason, why so many plans end up looking like this in reality when in fact they were planned to be a lot shorter is decision making. More specifically, slow decision making. And it's not even just slow decision making, it's just slower decision making from what was planned for. You think about the ideal assumption scenario where a software vendor or a system implementer gives you a plan, they're assuming that you're going to have quick decisions. And that doesn't typically happen. These are major business decisions that you usually have to make. And more often than not, organizations take longer than what was planned for in the plan. And what's even worse is then the end client ends up getting blamed for the fact that things ran way over because they couldn't make immediate on-the-fly, on-the-spot decisions, which isn't a realistic expectation in any scenario, but especially the more complex, the more global, the more diversified you are, this phenomena is going to be even more true. So making sure that you factored in some assumptions around how long it's going to take you to make decisions, especially those major business decisions, that's something you've got to factor into your plan because that will inevitably push out your timeline, and you want to go in with realistic expectations to begin. Now, in addition to decision making, another reason why so many project plans end up looking a lot different in reality in terms of duration is because of business process management and I'll call it general phase zero implementation planning sorts of activities. When an organization has not spent time up front defining business processes and it hasn't taken the time to get its governance in place and to get a framework and a team in place to prepare for the project, what happens is the plan starts before you're actually ready and before you have all the pieces in place. And inevitably, without the right plan, without the right resources being mobilized, without the right program governance in place, inevitably this is going to quickly turn into this. So making sure that you invest time and effort early on in phase zero before this plan starts is going to ensure that you have a better chance of achieving this plan. And by going through this BPM and phase zero process, you're going to know whether or not this is realistic or not because you've taken the time to validate the plan, to incorporate all the missing pieces of the plan into the plan so that now you have a realistic timeline, not an overly aggressively compressed timeline, which is not realistic to begin with. So one of the biggest takeaways from this is to ensure that you do a proper phase zero, including making major business decisions that you want to make, especially if you're a global organization or you're trying to standardize operations or change your business processes, change jobs, incorporate AI into people's jobs. Those are big decisions that take time, and the more you can spend time up front doing that, the more likely you are to accelerate the implementation of the actual technology. A third reason why so many project plans run way over the expected plan is because of testing. And I'm not just talking about software testing here, although that is part of it. Most software vendors are pretty good at testing their software and making sure that there's no technical bugs, but that's rarely the problem in the testing cycles. The major problem that we typically see in these testing cycles is the user acceptance or the conference from pilot testing. So those are more business-oriented testing to ensure that you've simulated your business in a digital twin sort of environment where you're testing out what these future state processes are going to be and you're validating that the processes work. The software may work, but that doesn't mean the processes and the workflows for your business are going to work. So we need to make sure that we do both. We do the technical testing and the user acceptance testing. And the problem here is that most software vendors severely underestimate this, or they just assume technical testing and maybe one round, maybe 2 rounds at the most of really high-level user acceptance testing. But that's arguably the most important part of testing, and you want to spend several cycles going through that because each cycle will expose problems or potential showstoppers in your implementation, and you need time to fix those problems, whether it's revisiting your business process, revisiting the technology, fixing some data, managing the integration better, whatever it is, you're going to find problems. You need to make sure you have time via multiple iterations to capture all that, but most plans that are unrealistic don't include that, and that's why we need to add a dose of reality to ensure we've got proper testing in our plan. Another reason why so many project plans run way over the initial stated plan is because of a lack of focus on training or a lack of time committed to training. Now, typically software vendors are going to incorporate a train the trainer work stream within their plan. That's this plan right here. But training the trainer is a lot different than the trainers going out and training hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of employees that are going to be severely affected by this project and by the changes. So we need to make sure that we've got multiple rounds of training, that we facilitated the entire training process, and it's going to take a lot longer to train your employees than it's going to take to train the trainers. But the software vendor's project plan typically has train the trainer. They have not incorporated the mass training for employees. So in order to have a realistic plan and a complete plan, we need to make sure that if we're going to reflect reality in a realistic way, that we have the full training captured in the overall plan and strategy. Another reason why so many plans start off looking like this in the initial planning phase, but then end up looking like this in reality, is because of data management. Oftentimes there is a very small one line item bullet footnote in your statement of work with your software vendor that says they're going to migrate the data, but they're not going to clean it up, they're not going to map it, they're not going to validate it. They're going to take the data you give them and they're going to put it in the new system. Well, that's not nearly good enough. That's just barely scraping the tip of the iceberg. We need to look at the entire data set, clean it up, validate it, make sure the mapping is correct. We might need to change our entire data structure. Those are all big deals. You think about your chart of accounts. You might have multiple charts of accounts you need to clean up. You might have a new part numbering nomenclature you're going to need to use for the new system. You might have duplicate vendors and customers in your system that you want to clean up and consolidate so that you can actually get better visibility into the operations. Those are all things that take a lot of time, and they typically are not captured in this plan, but yet you're on the hook for them. They're assuming you're going to do it, and they're going to assume you're going to do it as fast as they can roll out technology, but that's rarely the case. Data management is typically what pushes these projects out. So again, we need to have an agnostic view of the program to make sure that we've incorporated data management adequately in our overall plan. Another reason why so many plans start off looking like this, but then they end up looking like this, is because of change management. This is the people side of things, the organizational change, human side of the overall transformation, arguably the most important part of the entire project. However, most software vendors don't do this stuff. Most plans from software vendors and system integrators only include really, really light change management, like basic training, basic communications, but you're on the hook for ensuring that you've defined what your future state's going to look like. You're on the hook for defining what your people's jobs are going to look like. You're on the hook to figure out how people are going to use AI in the new environment or how to make their processes more efficient. That all takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of time to get people on board with the changes to fully understand the changes, not just the technology, but the changes to their jobs, the changes to their processes, the changes to the workflows, all that stuff. So we need a complete change management program if we want to have a realistic plan, and this plan that you typically get from a software vendor is nowhere close to addressing the change management needs, which is why that's something we provide to our clients, is helping them define what the change strategy is and incorporating that into the overall plan. And by the way, if you'd like to learn more about change management and how you can incorporate that into your overall plan and strategy, be sure to read our guide to change management. You can find that right here, scan the QR code here, or go to the links below. Now, one last reason why so many projects start off looking like this, but they end up looking like this in reality, is because they haven't incorporated the time to stabilize the environment and to optimize the environment before moving into the next phase of the project. Most projects are not single phase, big bang implementations unless you're a smaller organization, but for any mid-size or larger organization, you're probably going to have a phased rollout. And in that phased rollout, you're going to deploy different technologies in different places at different times. And what these underestimated plans typically do is they assume that you're going to go live in one location. Maybe at the most you'll have 30 days of hypercare support, and then you're going to move on to the next one. You're going to move on to the next phase. But what we find is it typically takes months to really fine-tune and optimize what you can do to increase the value of your project, but also to take those lessons and apply those to the next phases of the project. If we rush through hypercare, all we're doing is just stabilizing it to where we can actually just operate as a business. We're not looking yet at how we maximize ROI, how we can learn from that to make the next phase of our project better, but yet the project plans most vendors provide is very compressed and doesn't leave enough time for that. So if we want to be truly successful in our project, we'll include some additional stabilization, especially in the early phases of the project. That first pilot location is probably going to be a bit rocky compared to the ones later in the project. So why not take the time to get it right, fine-tune, optimize, learn, and then apply those lessons to the next phase so that eventually it becomes a bit more cookie cutter, a bit more predictable and consistent throughout the entire implementation. So make sure you include stabilization as well. So that was a whiteboard video for my YouTube channel where I talk about how to define a realistic project plan from the start. What were some of your thoughts and takeaways from that, Darian?
Yeah, I loved how you walked us through step by step in the video about what to do if your project plan is wrong and how you should be mapping it out for all companies. I feel like I have a couple different key questions following up from this about the red flags that you're experiencing and everything like that. So, what are the earliest signs that a project plan is not realistic before we miss the first major milestone of a project?
Well, if you have gone with the first proposed plan that you receive from your vendor, and that is the reality, that's what you're basing your overall plan on. If you're basing it on what the vendor has proposed to you, then I can almost guarantee you it's not right. And part of it is because they don't know, they being the vendor typically doesn't know enough about your business to know exactly how long it's going to take. Second of all, most plans aren't realistic to begin with. And third of all, the assumptions are usually off. So usually, if you really read carefully in the behind the assumptions of how fast it's assumed that you're going to make decisions, of how fast you're going to be able to clean up your data, of how much time you have to train the trainer or for your trainers to go train your mass employees. There's all these little but not so little caveats or assumptions in their plans, and if you haven't gone through and vetted those assumptions, then I can almost assure you that it's off. Because think about it from a vendor perspective, they're not going to assume the worst when they're trying to sell you software and their services. They're going to assume the best. So they're going to lead with the best case scenario because the best case scenario sells. And unless you push back and say, well, this is not a best case scenario, we don't have the resources to clean up data in that amount of time, or we're a slow moving organization that has trouble making decisions. So we are not going to make immediate on the spot decisions in every workshop we're in. If you don't challenge those assumptions and extend and adjust the plan accordingly, then it was never right to begin with. And this is really important because it's not just about time, it's about money too. Because let's just say a 24-month project becomes 30 months. Well, okay, that's 6 months more than you thought, which is a problem. But what's arguably even a bigger deal is that now you've just added that 24 months, it became 30 months. What's the math there? It's about 25% longer. So that means you've now increased the cost by about 25%, maybe even more. And so the run rate is the same. So they assume it's going to take, in this case, 24 months. And so they staff the project for 24 months. And when it becomes 30 months, they actually make more because they didn't cut back resources to accommodate your longer period, because they were hoping that you could do it in 24, but you didn't. So now it's 30. So they actually benefit from the fact that you ran over. So now you're spending more time and money, and you've demoralized the team, and you've disappointed a lot of people internally, and everyone's stressed out. So there's just so much collateral damage that goes with these blown project plans. And you've got trusted advisors that are allegedly trusted advisors in your software vendors and technical implementers that are convincing you that this unrealistic scenario is somehow realistic when it never was and never is.
For sure. And another question on top of that, how do you build in stabilization and optimization without making the plan feel quote unquote too long for executives that are really focused on speed in these projects?
Yeah, well, I'd say a lot of times the focus on speed is what leads to delays, ironically, because the focus on speed leads to cutting quarters, bad decisions. Usually the vendor wants you to focus on speed because they want you to go fast. They want you to start tomorrow. Let's just go full speed tomorrow because I can put all my people on this project starting tomorrow if you just let me do it, and if you just let us move fast. So so that's what I would say is don't fool yourself into thinking that by going fast you're actually going to go faster. You have to be smart and speedy. And that's a tricky balance for a lot of executives. But when they've run into problems like this, a lot of times it's a lot easier to convince them that they screwed up and they're actually making things worse because they already see the collateral damage. It's harder at the beginning of a project to not go fast because you want, let's go, instead of like taking time for a phase zero to lay out the foundation for how you're going to deploy the technology. Let's just go. But yet we're going in a very bad direction that doesn't make sense. in many cases. So that's the fine line or the balancing act that we have to walk.
For sure. And last question of the day today, how can boards and executive team use different resources, or what resources are out there for them to use to pressure test the plans they're being asked to approve?
Well, I'd say a couple things. One is, pressure test the assumptions, like I mentioned a moment ago, but also pressure test what else should be in the plan that is outside the realm of what the software vendor does. And this is one of the biggest failure points or traps, is that client gets proposal from software vendor. It says X amount of time, X resources, X dollars. And then they base the whole plan on that. But really their program, the overall program should involve a lot more than just that one vendor. There's all these other things that the vendor doesn't do or doesn't do well that you've got to factor in as well. And a lot of that's internal stuff that you have to do. And you've got to merge all those plans together into one cohesive plan. And if you haven't done that, then you do not have a plan. You have one work stream defined. That one work stream doesn't matter really, because it's not the overall program. It's just what one work stream is going to do. It's almost like if you want to build a house, the plumber comes to you and gives you a plan, and you base the whole plan for building the house on what the plumber tells you it's going to take to do their part of the job. It just doesn't make sense. But yet it somehow, for some reason, seems to make sense for a lot of organizations. When they hire the technical vendors, they think, well, the vendors are going to come in and do this all for me. Well, you just hired the plumber. You don't have the whole house built. You have plumbing, but you don't know what the rest of the house looks like. So that's probably the best thing I can think of to maybe help it resonate for leaders out there.
For sure. Yeah. What a great conversation today. I feel like there was a lot of good advice given.
Yeah, I'm glad you like it. Hope the audience liked it too. Thank you for your help and participation here today. Thanks to the audience for the great questions. We have new episodes of this show every Wednesday, so check us out next Wednesday again. You can also go to transformationgroundcontrol.com to see all the past episodes. If you want to go watch any of the past episodes we've ever done, going all the way back to early 2021, you can go back and peruse those at your leisure at transformationgroundcontrol.com. If you'd like to collaborate with us on this podcast or any other content that we create, please look at the contact information we've included below for Major Tom Productions, and you can inquire and chat with us about how we could collaborate in some of our content. And as always, if you need help with your digital transformation, reach out to Third Stage Consulting or myself personally if you'd like to talk about your project and what some of the challenges are you might be facing, and be glad to have a conversation with you about what you could be doing to get your project on track or to get started in the right direction or wherever you may be in the project. So hope you have a great week. Thanks for being here again. We'll see you next week on the next episode of Transformation Ground Control. Take care.